Blog Talk Radio.
It's Thursday, August 9th, 2012. This is the Hermetic Hour. I'm your host, Poke Runyon, and tonight we present a discussion on Satanism and its relation to the Western esoteric tradition. We will trace its early historical precedents. That's Set and Tiamat, Nergal, Ahriman, and how these demonic elements were incorporated into the biblical tradition as contenders in the service of God. And we'll discuss Gnostic ideas about the Cain and Abel biblical perversity, the Gnostic evil demiurge, and the medieval Luciferians. Moving into the Hermetic tradition in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we will explain high magic's sophisticated idea based upon ancient Egyptian concepts of controlling and using dark forces with the power of light. And then we will trace the descent of magic following the Reformation into the Faustian school of the Baroque period with its demonic pacts, finally evolving or devolving into full-blown Satanism in the decadent fin de siècle era in the late 19th century France. And we'll mention several books by famous authors taking the devil's side, and we'll recount our afternoon with Tony Levy and his wife, and I'll even recall my own meeting with the devil himself. You know, the bottom line in all of this is that old Nick cannot be avoided in any serious practice of magic because it's based on biblical traditions, and he is very much a part of those traditions. But he should never be worshipped or allowed to run your show. He is an advisor, a consultant, and even a friendly one at times, but you should always remember he works for God, and he plays God's game. So, as we said, tune in and we'll tell you how to get to heaven before the devil knows you're dead. That's an old Irish toast, by the way. Yeah. Oh, just to tell you how to get to heaven before the devil knows you're dead. Yeah. Okay, so this is going to be a very, very interesting show, and I hope we'll surprise you with a few things you didn't know and give you some perspectives you may not have been aware of. Now, as we said, following the outline that we just set forth, before the biblical tradition, Genesis was written down actually during the Babylonian captivity, and that's several hundred years before Christ, but it wasn't written down 6,000 years ago or anything like that. It was written down a few hundred years before Christ, and the biblical stories, Genesis and the Adam and Eve and all of that, were put together drawing on earlier traditions and incorporating them into this monotheistic amalgam, shall we say. And these precedents were both ancient Egyptian and, of course, Mesopotamian, Assyrian, and to some extent Canaanite, and even Persian. And so we'll start off here with Set. This gets rather complicated, and one of the reasons why we need to kind of look at Set a little bit is because one of the modern satanic groups decided to replace Satan with Set, and they had so we'll discuss Set and who Set was and who Set was transformed into, and how Set eventually ended up being synonymous with Satan. Now, Set was, as you recall, those of you who knew something about Egyptian mythology, Set was the brother of Osiris, and Osiris was the ancient Egyptian Christ-like figure. Osiris was a vegetation god. He was a god of the dead. Osiris was a great civilizer and a teacher, and Set, his brother, was jealous of him, according to the legend, and Set tricked him and murdered him and cut him up, and Osiris's phallus went floating away, and finally ended up, according to one version of the legend, in Phoenicia, and ended up buried in a tree and whatever. But the key thing here is that Set was by the time the ancient Hebrews arrived in Egypt, Set was an adversary of Osiris, and Osiris was a Christ-like figure that the Egyptians venerated, and he was one of the main central figures in Egyptian mythology. And Set was already becoming adversarial to the Egyptians. Well, according to Egyptian history, the people that in the Bible that we know as the Hebrews were, according to Egyptian history, they were called the Hyksos, and they came in not as poor people looking for a job, like it says in the Bible. They came in as conquerors, and according to Egyptian history, and they took over for several hundred years, and they forced the Egyptians to worship Set. And the reason why, according to what's come down to us, is that they had a desert war god called Sutek. And Sutek, a war god, very much like Yahweh, probably, according to, well, you can imagine if you want to that Sutek was actually originally or became Yahweh. So the Hyksos lorded it over the Egyptians, especially the northern Egyptians, and they forced the Egyptians to worship Set, and they desecrated the other temples and whatever, and the Egyptians just hated them, but they put up with it, and then finally, this is all according to Egyptian history now, but finally the Egyptians had enough of it, and they got the Ethiopians to help them, and they ran the Hyksos, or if you want to consider the Hebrews, they ran out. And according to Egyptian history, Moses was actually a priest of Osiris. Now, we can wonder about that, but at least he was the last leader of the Hyksos, and led the Hyksos, Hebrews, worshippers of Sutek, Set, and whatever out. Now, so therefore, you could say that Set, Sutek, and if you want to think Yahweh, the dark side of Yahweh, okay, think that too. That may be one of the origins of Satan. And now over on the other side, over where the Jews were in captivity later on, they, of course, encountered the Assyrian, Mesopotamian mythology, and they had Tiamat, the great chaotic mother monster. The mother monster goddess was a gigantic serpent, And so they transformed that in the Bible into Leviathan, and also that was also based on the Canaanite version, which was male, called Lotan. This giant serpent of chaos. This is where we get the idea of the dragon of chaos comes from Tiamat and Lotan and Leviathan. And this gets equated with the devil and with Satan, especially in the book of Revelations. You have the old dragon and all, and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So that's where this comes from. Now, Nergal was a ancient Babylonian god who was dark and evil and warlike. And so some of his aspects end up in the adversary. Ariman was considered that's Persian, by the way, and that was considered. Ariman was considered the god of illusion and the god of the material, which was illusion. And if you can figure that one out, and so that also has an aspect to it. He was the opponent of Ahura Mazda, the god of light, and so Ariman was the god of darkness. So that also has aspects to this. Now, when this monotheistic biblical religion, which we have all had imposed upon us, rightly or wrongly or whatever, and that's both in the Jewish and the Christian tradition. And, of course, as we're all aware, fundamental Christians are more interested in the Old Testament and the book of Revelations than they are in anything Jesus ever said. So we have to, when we talk about Satan, we really have to look at this Old Testament thing very, very closely. Now, one of the things that we got to realize about this is that Yahweh then became the one and only God. No, he wasn't even the one and only God in the Bible. He wasn't. If you read the Old Testament carefully, which I don't know. I mean, I try to figure out. Sometimes I try to figure out just what parts of the Bible that the fundamental Christians really do read, because some of their beliefs just don't match up at all with what's in the Bible. But in the beginning, in Genesis, it becomes pretty obvious that there are lots of other gods besides Yahweh. And, in fact, in the Ten Commandments, it says, you shall place no other God before me. It doesn't say that there aren't any others. It says, oh, boy. And, of course, we had the Elohim, all of the Elohim. And the Elohim is plural, for heaven's sake. And so a lot of gods going on here. But essentially, what they needed in formulating this monotheistic religion, they needed adversaries and an adversary, so they started off with adversaries, and because of the pluralism in the beginning, so the adversaries were the fallen angels. There's 200 of them, and they came down to earth and started teaching people all kinds of terrible things, and teaching them how to cook food and how to take care of themselves and how to do and how to forge metal and even how to do their hair and do their makeup for the gals and all these terrible things that they taught them how to do, and all of these fallen angels, Uzzah and Azazel, they got concentrated in the Jewish tradition down to Uzzah and Azazel. There's two of them, male and female. And then they got concentrated in the Islamic tradition into Marut and Harut, and there's another two. And then they finally got concentrated into Satan, the devil. They kept condensing them and condensing them. They had to have an adversary. Now, next week we're going to talk about these fallen angels. We're going to spend the whole show talking about the Book of Enoch and the fallen angels and the Nephilim and the Elohim and all of these hems and we're going to really get into that next week. But this week, let's just say this time that these fallen angels, who were teaching people things and were lusting after the daughters of men. Now, you can't imagine really that fallen angels lusting after the daughters of men these days, but what they really meant by that, I suppose, was they were diddling with our DNA, which they probably were, but whatever. Anyway, this got concentrated in Genesis, as we have it, as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the serpent of knowledge. And also the flip side of this is the serpent of wisdom, for heaven's sake, on Moses' rod and all this. And so all of this business that's supposed to be evil has a flip side that's also supposed to be good. And it's all rolled up and part of God's plan. And God, these guys have all been condensed and made into operatives of the Almighty. And that's the one thing I want you to be continually aware of in this whole process talking about Satan, is that Satan works for God. Now, maybe he doesn't, or the various sources of him didn't originally, but that's the way it turned out, and that's the way we get it in the biblical tradition, and that's the way we were raised in Sunday school, and that's the way we had it poured into ourselves, and so that makes it pretty darn real for us. And so therefore, if you were raised in any of these biblical traditions, then the devil is very real for you. Well, to be completely honest about it, Jesus Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, was a man. Sure, he was a man who realized the God within him, and he tried to teach everybody else that God was in them too, and so he's very enlightened and one of the greatest, mystic philosophers probably that ever lived, but he was still a man. However, the church decided, Emperor Constantine actually decided, no, we can't have that. If this religion is going to become the state religion, we got to deify this guy. We got to make him God, because otherwise we're not going to be able to control all these miserable peasants with this. If he's just some philosophical character, that's just not going to work. So Constantine took over the Council of Nicaea and told the bishops exactly what kind of religion they were going to have, and so Jesus becomes God, and that's real for millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of Christians. And when you were a kid, and when I was a kid, we got it poured into us. Oh, Jesus is real. Oh, gosh, Jesus is God. There he is. Oh, it's the Holy Trinity and all of this. And oh, boy. And it is. And it is very real. And one of the reasons why Jesus is real is because Jesus really does his teachings. Now, here again, fundamental Christians they don't bother reading his teachings. They just read the book of Revelations, and they read some books in the Old Testament. But Jesus really did. His teachings really do resonate and strongly appeal to 75% of the people on this planet. They do. And that's why it's the largest and in some ways, the most powerful religion on the planet, for that reason. So Jesus is very real to those of us who were raised in that. And that means that the devil is very real, because even though the devil, as we know, is a composite of all of these different elements, some of them real, some of them fanciful, whatever, but they're all been rolled together into a devil, and which means that if you were raised as a little Christian, even if you weren't a very good little Christian, but if you had it drilled into you, this means that the devil is just as real as Jesus. But what you also have to realize, and I will emphasize throughout this discussion, is that the devil and Jesus work for the same boss, and they play the same game. And if you let the devil, if you go over and pledge your soul to the devil, you've lost the game, because it's God's game and you lost. And you have to realize that. There is no such thing. If you really want to get away from Jesus and get away from Christianity, the devil's not the way to get away, because the devil and Jesus they're brothers. I mean, they're working for the same guy, and you have to realize that's the major message that I have to get across to you. Now, I'm not saying I don't like the devil. I mean, I met the devil. I've been through this whole thing with. I was raised as a good old Christian, and I've had my go around with the devil and all that, and I know how powerful the devil is, and all, so I'm not against the devil. But you have to realize that the devil is part of. The devil is biblical, and he works for God. Now, I was saying that we would discuss Gnostic ideas about Cain and Abel, biblical perversity. The Gnostics came along just about the same time Jesus did. In fact, Jesus was a Gnostic in a way, and they kind of looked at the Old Testament, and they looked at it with a fresh point of view, and they thought, hey, this Old Testament God, this Yahweh, this guy, he's evil. And they based this on the idea that he demanded blood sacrifice, and poor Cain and Abel. Cain, he was a farmer, and he brought his first fruits, and God looked at it, I don't want any first fruits, I want blood. And so Abel brings his lamb and put a little lamb and slaughters it. And God says, oh, that's what I want blood, yeah. So what is this? I mean, so some of the Gnostics, they just decided that Yahweh was an evil demiurge, and there was a better God, and which they thought Jesus was representative of, back across the abyss. And they may have had a pretty good view there, because maybe that. You can wonder whether or not that might have been the reason why Jesus was crucified, because he really may not have been when he was talking about his Father. I don't know whether he really was talking about Yahweh. You wonder, maybe he was talking about a God beyond Yahweh, perhaps, because 3 times in the Bible, Paul said, and several people, that he was a priest after the order of Melchizedek, and Melchizedek certainly was not a priest of Yahweh, a priest of El. And so we wonder about things like this, and the Gnostics wondered about things like this, and so they came up with, almost came up with a form of Satanism themselves. They get close to it. And this whole Gnostic point of view got into several sects in the Middle Ages, and one of these sects was called the Luciferians, because Lucifer was one of the names of Satan and referred to the angel of light, and he was one of the fallen angels. This developed after the Book of Enoch. This was a later development. But Lucifer became synonymous with Satan. And this Luciferian sect in Germany during the 1200s, they believed that they'd have their meetings in caverns. They'd go down in caves. And they believed that they got underground, that they were free from Yahweh's rulership, because Satan or Lucifer was the prince of the earth. And so all they had to do was get down underground, and then they were in Lucifer's kingdom, and they could do anything they wanted to. And oh boy, did they have fun. Oh boy, they blew the candles out. They had group gropes down there in the caverns and all. This is back in the 1200s. Of course, the Inquisition caught them, and you know what happened then. No one escapes the Inquisition. Oh boy! But anyway, that was perhaps the first. Yeah, kind of an isolated case, but that was the first example of operative Satanism in kind of in a modern way, but it was back then. And the idea being here that, here again, this was a dualism. And Christianity is a very dualist, at least in its theology that is presented to the masses. Now, the inner theology tends to be Neoplatonic, or at least Thomas Aquinas and those people, and that's monistic. But the philosophy that was taught to the people was dualist. The earth was evil. The earth was the realm of Satan. God was good and supernal, and all of this evil was caused by Satan. And we are all sinners, and all these evil thoughts are Satan. And so, of course, naturally, during the witchcraft persecutions and all of the survivals of the various pagan gods and goddesses, they all got transmuted as far as the church was concerned into the devil and the demons. Now, so what actually happened in magic? High magic. High magic was practiced in the late Middle Ages and in the early Renaissance. High magic was practiced in the Hermetic tradition. And now, we've discussed the Hermetic tradition time and time again on this program, and I think all of our listeners, you know what the Hermetic tradition is. It's a kind of a Gnostic theology on a Neoplatonic philosophical framework. And it is elitist in the sense that Hermetic magicians and philosophers are aware that everyone is equally ensouled by God, and the only place you're ever going to find God is inside yourself. And if you reach to God within yourself, you have become enlightened, and you therefore define your own morality, you define your own salvation, you are your own, literally, you are in direct communication with God. And that's the Hermetic proposition. Not for everybody, believe me, but that was it. Well, now, in the Renaissance, late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, this philosophy was known and employed by some very astute philosophers and very well-educated people. Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Miranda, Giordano Bruno, he got burned at the stake. But most of them were, the church didn't have a problem with them. They were enlightened Christians, and they even got Catholic imprimaturs on their books. And how did they do this? Well, they did it by accepting the validity of Christianity and professing to be Christians. But then at the same time, they were magicians, and they were within a certain reason, they were calling forth and mastering the forces of darkness. There was in those days, all the way up to 1614, unless you really, really went over the line like Giordano Bruno did, you could actually do this. You could call forth planetary spirits and planetary angels and elementals, gnomes and salamanders, and you do all this. You might get in a little trouble if you started doing actual demons. You might keep that to yourself, and of course they did, except for Bruno, who Bruno really got the bit in his teeth and ran with it. He started supporting Copernicus, and the church came down on him about that. But then, to make it worse, he said, well, yes, the earth does revolve around the sun, and the sun is God. And at that point, they said, take him to the stake and burn him, which they did. So he couldn't go too far with it. But what happened in 1614 was that a philologist, that's a person who studies languages, ancient languages and all. A philologist by the name of Casaubon discovered that the Hermetic treatises that they were working with were post-Christian and not pre-Christian. And what this indicated was that they were pagan, which they were. But that meant that the church was in an embarrassing situation. They could no longer support Hermetic philosophy because it was post-Christian and Christ wasn't mentioned. And so therefore, they had to reverse, no more imprimaturs on Hermetic magic books and whatever. And so 1614 was kind of a watermark on this. And this didn't apply to England so much, but it did apply all over Catholic Europe, which was a large chunk of the civilized part of Europe at that time. And this started, and then the Reformation that followed, started something that became ultimately rather sinister and goes into our satanic thing. See, before that time, magicians could be, and it made perfectly good sense for them to be nominally Christian. They could be Christian, but they could still practice pretty much the full spectrum of magic. They didn't have to. They weren't in danger of being persecuted like witches or anything like that. In fact, Pico Della Miranda even wrote a book against witches, actually. But after 1614, that was when Hermetic magic, was looked upon as, began to look upon as being demonic. Now, this then followed the Reformation. And the Reformation, of course, as you all know, this was the fanatical Protestants on one side and fanatical Catholics on the other, and it became a bloodbath and a terrible intolerance and religious fanaticism swept over Europe for 30 years, and so you had a horrible mess. It wiped out the Rosicrucian movement before it ever got started. And what it rose up in its aftermath was something that we refer to as the Faustian school of magic. And this is where we start getting into the emphasis upon the demonic. And even in the Faustian school, you prayed to Jesus, you prayed to God to bring up the devil. And then when you got the devil up there, when you got the devil, then it was making deals with the devil, which the old magicians never did. The old magicians, if they ever dealt with the devil himself, they didn't mention it, but they controlled evil spirits and elementals, and they controlled them. And that's what we do today, of course, in the Hermetic tradition. We control these demonic or rebellious spirits. We control them, and we use the power of light. We use the angels and all that. So we're still following that Renaissance tradition, which, by the way, does relate to ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians, they controlled the rebellious and chaotic forces with the power of Ra and Osiris and the good gods, and they would know the names of those spirits, control them all. So this is a very old tradition, and it's rather sophisticated because, the best way to explain that is this: Christianity is actually a good thing because for most people, for 75% of the people who in the world who really want security and they want a fair, they want to be paid well for a day's work, and they want to have security, and they want to be able to raise a family, and they want to have the good life, but they are not driven toward success and leadership and making a name for themselves and being being rewarded for it. They don't. That's not what they want. They want satisfaction. They don't want the glory of success. But 25% of the people in the world do want. They want to lead. They want to get out there and make something of themselves. They want to be rich. They want to be famous. They want to be somebody. And so these are the people that Christianity. Well, it's good for them in one way because it keeps them aware that yes, they are human beings, and yes, they do owe something to all the rest of the human beings, and all of that. So it's good for them, and it's but it's rough for them if they're raised in a home where they have Christianity and all these principles that they ram down their throat like it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle and all that, that stuff. You can imagine how tough that is for somebody who really wants to be, who wants to be successful, who wants to be a leader. So the result is that Christianity is a good thing. It's a good thing, and if you want to be respected in society, that is a Christian society especially, you don't want to be a Satanist. You want to be a Christian. But you also want to be free to express yourself. And if you're a magician, you want to be free to explore all the various things you want to explore. And so what ends up happening here, and after the Reformation and after all of this, magic and a whole bunch of other activities got to be very suspect. Now, one of the things, of course, that rose up after all of this was the Masonic movement. One of the reasons why it did was to get around all of this hatred and all of this prejudice and everything so people could get together. And but meanwhile, magic, especially in Europe, is sliding down toward this idea of making pacts with the demons and then finally making pacts with the devil. Now, the Mephistopheles story, the Faust story, and you all know these. It just never turns out very well. It might turn out okay in the short run, but it never turns out very well. And of course, the reason why it doesn't turn out very well is because, as I say, the devil's always worked for God. He always does. And if you start worshiping him, you really have sold your soul, because you're gonna regret it. And it's obvious that this is not just some kind of a threat. This is obvious because you're buying into the whole thing. You sell your soul to the devil, and you have just bought into the whole idea of going to hell. And you don't have to have that idea. That idea, you can reject that idea. You can just, but in order to reject it, you not only have to reject their version of God, but you also have to reject the devil, because the devil is very closely connected. He is the flip side of their version of God, and that needs to be understood. So you're much better off becoming a pagan. Find a pagan tradition that appeals to you. That's fine, and but the one thing though that I want to point out in this is that the power of Satanism, as eventually became obvious in the fin de siècle period in France, in the Baroque period, what you had was that this was after the French Revolution, after the era of Enlightenment. All of the thinkers, all of the philosophers, the thinkers, and the intellectuals of the world were all completely atheists at that time, or almost all of them were. And yet, at the same time, little French children were still being raised by flocks of penguins and having all of this Catholic stuff poured into them. So consequently, if you had if you want to do a black mass, boy, think of the power you could raise with these people who have had this all poured into them. And they did. And, of course, the people who promoted this French Satanism were kind of unscrupulous, and they knew that they could get a tremendous magical charge from these people who had been raised as Roman Catholics in what was otherwise a society of free-thinking atheists. So the Black Mass became kind of a popular thing about that time. In fact, with the exception of the Luciferians back in the Middle Ages having their orgies down in caves, I don't think that there were really any real Black Mass. Well, there might have been a few perverted clergymen who did a few of them, but they didn't talk about it. But this business of these organized Black Masses really didn't get going until the late 1800s in France, and around the turn of the century, what they call the fin de siècle, or the end of the era. And there's a period of debauchery and decadence and what have you. Now, the book that covers this, the most famous book, is Huysmans Labas. That's Labas. Now, but while we're talking about the Enlightenment and the devil, let's be a little more complimentary to the devil himself, providing we understand that. Understanding you don't want to worship the devil, okay, but you don't want to worship him. But he really did serve a great purpose for a number of people. Now, during this Baroque era, the great Christian mystic philosopher Swedenborg came up with his voluminous books on heaven and what heaven was all about, and handbooks on hell and whatever. But Swedenborg was, even though he was a very creative, hardworking, successful person himself, he completely bought into this Christian idea that you weren't supposed to vanity and pride and pride in your work and seeking any kind of recognition for your work, anything like that was bad. And you were supposed to be completely humble, and you were supposed to be completely self-effacing, and you were supposed to give everything you had to the poor and all this kind of stuff. And in fact, Swedenborg's books, if you were to remove the word good, if you were to go through his books, computerize them all, and then just have a program that would remove the word good from his books completely, you would shorten the length of his books by over one half. Now, William Blake, the great English poet and philosopher and the inventor of the comic book, William Blake was an ardent Swedenborgian when he was young, ardent Swedenborgian, because Swedenborg really did have a very, very insightful handle on the afterlife and a lot of things like that. And it was very convincing. So Blake was an ardent Swedenborgian, but then Blake was an artist and a poet and a creative person, and he began to realize that Swedenborg, there was no room in Swedenborg's philosophy for those people, those 25% of people who really want to create and want to be recognized for their creation, want to be, they want to make something of themselves, and they want to have some success. And there was no place for these people in Swedenborg's philosophy. And these people were supposed to be made continually feel guilty that they wanted to do something and get recognition and be paid for it and amount to something. They were supposed to feel continually guilty about this. And Blake just said, wait a minute. that's not right. So Blake made a break from Swedenborg, and what he did was he created a little book, a little comic book actually, well, along with poetry and whatever, and he created a little graphic, well, I call it a graphic novel. Actually, it's more like, let's say it's kind of an illustrated novelette or something like that. It looks like, in a way, it kind of looks like a graphic novel. And it was called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And this is just delightful, because the devil just really comes into his own, and you're putting. So what Blake did was he instead of having the devil act as the adversary and the tempter to try to get people, to deliver them to God so God could damn them, and instead of doing that, he turns around and he puts the devil and God together, working together to make people enjoy, to let people have an enjoyable life and actually make something of themselves. And it's just beautiful. I can't recommend it enough. And in fact, I like it. To tell you the truth, I like The Marriage of Heaven and Hell better than I like Crowley's Book of the Law. And the reason why I do is The Marriage of Heaven and Hell it's not vicious or it's not compassionless. It's a positive kind of a thing, and so I really think that was great. Now, but Blake wasn't the only one. I mean, gosh, Mark Twain wrote stories on the devil and had a wonderful time doing it. Gurdjieff wrote a very big thing called Beelzebub's Tales to his grandchildren. And one book that I have that I want to recommend that really gives you an insight on all of this came out about 1900, and it's a great book. It's still available. It's called The History of the Devil and the Idea of Evil by Dr. Paul Carus. Dr. Paul Carus. And this is a whole wrap-up of where the devil came from and all the way up through, and gives you a real good concept of all of that. By the way, as I said in here, and Taylor Caldwell wrote New York Times bestseller by the novelist Taylor Caldwell, came out in 1967, Dialogues with the Devil, and that's another one. Now, I said in the abstract here that we would discuss, let's see, a recount by afternoon with Tony Levy and his wife, and then my own meeting with the devil himself. So we'll talk about that. Back in 1969, I was just getting started in ceremonial magic, and I had met a local Satanist down in Hollywood, Don Blythe. I met and dropped in on him a few times, and he mentioned me apparently to Tony Levy. That's Anton LaVey, and so Tony and his wife Diane dropped in on me. I had an apartment out in Manhattan Beach, and I had all my equipment, of course, there and set up and whatever. And we spent the afternoon. It was very pleasant. And Tony said, he said, I was a ceremonial magician for years. He said, and he said, but I couldn't make any money at it. And so he said, what I did, I just painted my house black and declared that we were the Church of Satan. And boy, I said, ever since then, he said, we've been doing great. And he told me, he said, the big thing that we've got is our ID card, and people join the Church of Satan. They get this ID card with a nice little logo on it that shows that they're members of the Church of Satan, and they can splash this card to when they get bugged by Jesus freaks at work or wherever, they flash this card on them, and that's why they join. And so he said we got about 10,000 members because they want this card. Well, I know that's true because I was working at Rockwell a few years later, and I was at a cubicle with a couple of other engineers in this cubicle, and we had a Jesus freak in there with us. And every time he would pull out the Bible and try to preach to us, the guy next to me would pull out a copy of Cavendish's The Black Arts and say, well, now we'll hear it from the other side. And it's the only thing that would shut him up. So that I could see how Tony could actually make a success with this. Now, as far as meeting the devil himself, I did. I don't think that really, if you really, you raised a biblical tradition, and ceremonial magic is kind of, Hermetic ceremonial magic is Masonic and biblical and pagan and all of this rolled into one. And so therefore, because it has this biblical base, we all have the devil in there, the little devil that gets on one side, the left ear, and he whispers, and the little angel on the right side, and he whispers, and we all got him. And I remember Flip Wilson, I think, the devil made me buy this dress. Yeah, well, anyway, we all got the devil. And so one night, I was down in the temple all by myself, and I'm not going to tell you how I did this because I don't want to encourage anybody. I don't want to send anybody on the path of sin, so I will not describe how I did this. But I did it, and I managed to get the devil in the mirror. Now, I didn't go originally for the devil, but I mean that's what happened, and I couldn't get rid of him. I mean, I couldn't actually. He would not go away, and he had this face. His face was almost like a theatrical mask, one of those masks like the Phantom of the Opera. It's just kind of the symbolic features, and that was all, this mask. But he had me, and this was very intense. And he started talking, and he said, "Oh, come on," he says, "you've always been a Satanist." He said, "All of these spirits that you summon, they're all me. What are you fooling yourself for? Come on. Yeah, you saying that come on. You know that I'm behind all this. You know that." And I got really scared, and I really was frightened. And I broke out. I actually broke the circle. I ran to the shrine and opened the doors to the little Tophet. And inside the Tophet, I have the statue of Baal and Astarte locked together in convex, and Baal's on his back and Astarte sitting on him like Shakti and Shiva. And the light just lighted, of course. And so I'm looking at Astarte and I'm saying, "Please, Astarte, tell me this isn't true." And the statuette comes to life. And she's smiling at me and she said, "Yes, it is true." And I said, What? What do you mean? And she said, "Yes, it is true. It's all the devil and me, and I'm God." And this tremendous sense of relief flows over me, because what she had just said was the whole secret of Tantra, as far as the Tantrics are concerned, and the Briatic yin-yang. And yes, everything is really, if you want to be truthful about it, it's the goddess and the devil. Because man's work, all of man's creative work and everything else usually ends up causing just as much trouble as any. The comfort, the good we get out of it is counterbalanced by all the destructive power and the pollution and everything else that man produces. And women put up with it and nurture and breed more men. And so, yeah. And according to the Tantrics, the Shiva just lies there and Shakti moves. So she's God, and the male counterpart, the horned god, he's the devil, and that's it. From that point of view and that perspective. And I was relieved, because I was scared. And now, so I don't want to give the impression that that's all there is, but that, from that perspective, that's true. And so the devil is in all of us, but the devil is a personification of all of these various forces of creativity, these Promethean forces, these Faustian forces, these creative forces. We need the balance of the goddess. We need the balance of even the balance of gentle Jesus and his philosophy, even though it applies more to 75% of us than 25% of us, but still, we all need to be compassionate because we are all children of God. I mean, we're all equally ensouled. And so the idea is that if you accept all of this, that means that, yeah, sure, you can be successful. Sure, you can be a leader. Certainly you can be rewarded. Certainly you can have success. And yet, at the same time, you should think that you're serving mankind. You're making the world a better place. You're helping. You're creating jobs. You're adding to. You should. And so the bottom line on all of this is that the devil is a composite. Yeah, but he's real for us. Those of us who were raised in the biblical traditions, he's real. But here again, he is a composite figure. But then Jesus has been deified, where Jesus really probably shouldn't have been deified, but he was. And so he has become real by being deified, real within us, and the devil has become real because they needed a devil to do what the devil does. But the point that I'm making is, make friends with the devil, listen to the devil, but don't play the devil's game, because that's what he's trying to do. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to get you to play his game, and if you do, you lose. And as long as you know that, and he knows you know that, then don't hate him, because he's just doing his job. Anyway, next week we are going to discuss along the same theme. We're going to dig into the whole idea of the fallen angels, and that including the Anunnaki and all of the various extrapolations from that. And so, in the meantime, good magic, and tune in next week.